Hey everyone, here's a question for you. What if I told you that India's Cold War wasn't just about communism versus capitalism, but a full-blown shadow war with spies, propaganda, and secret alliances that went far deeper than we were ever told? Today, we're diving into one of the most underreported chapters of global intelligence history, South Asia's secret Cold War. We'll explore how British and American spies operated in post-independence India, how Indian leaders secretly worked with them while preaching non-alignment, and how these covert operations shaped the region's politics, paranoia, and power struggles. This is based on Paul McGarr's excellent book, Spying in South Asia. Let's get into it. When India gained independence in 1947, it stood proudly as a leader of the non-aligned movement. Nehru often spoke of sovereignty, neutrality, and staying out of Cold War power games. But behind closed doors, his government quietly worked with both British and American intelligence, MI5, MI6, and yes, the CIA. Why? Because post-colonial India was fragile. Partition had torn the country apart, the economy was shaky, communist movements were gaining steam, and there were growing threats from both China and Pakistan. To put it simply, India needed help, especially when it came to intelligence and internal security. So while the rhetoric was anti-imperial, the reality was pragmatic. Now, if you're from the region, you've probably heard the phrase foreign hand before. It became a popular way for Indian politicians, especially during crises, to suggest that outside forces were stirring up trouble. And often, they weren't wrong. The CIA was definitely active in India. British intelligence kept many of its old colonial networks alive, and Soviet agencies, the KGB and GRU, ran some of their most aggressive influence operations in India during the 1960s and 70s. By the late Cold War, even Soviet defectors admitted they had dozens of sources inside India's defense, intelligence, and foreign ministries. And in 1967, something straight out of a spy novel happened. Stalin's own daughter, Svetlana Alayuleva, defected to the West by walking into the U.S. Embassy in Delhi under the noses of Soviet minders. This wasn't just East versus West anymore. India had become one of the main battlegrounds for global espionage. McGarr's book doesn't just talk about spies and operations, it also looks at information warfare. For example, the British Foreign Office ran a secret propaganda wing called the Information Research Department, IRD, feeding anti-communist content into Indian media. Meanwhile, the Soviets weren't exactly quiet. In the 1970s, they were covertly funding newspapers, magazines, even book publishers in India to spread anti-CIA narratives and pro-Soviet sentiment. But here's the twist. These foreign campaigns actually played into India's domestic politics. Leaders like Indira Gandhi used the idea of the foreign hand to discredit critics, censor the press, and justify crackdowns, even when those hands were imaginary. So the spy war didn't just influence diplomacy. It changed how Indians viewed freedom, democracy, and dissent, and turned intelligence into a tool of domestic repression. But India wasn't just a passive target. It was learning fast. Under leaders like Patel and later Indira Gandhi, India built its own robust intelligence system, the IB and the Research and Analysis Wing, RAW. And as the Cold War dragged on, these agencies grew bolder. McGarr points out something most Western readers miss. By the early 1960s, Indian intelligence was playing both sides, sometimes leveraging the CIA against the KGB, and vice versa. And in certain cases, they just went solo. Like when India helped the Dalai Lama escape from Tibet in 1959 with CIA support, or later when Indian agencies began funding their own foreign propaganda and running influence operations in neighboring countries like Sri Lanka and Nepal. So what happened after the Cold War ended? McGarr argues that many of the assumptions held by Western intelligence failed. They believed India would align more closely with the West. They believed covert support would pull India away from the Soviets. And they believed they could operate in the shadows without being exposed. Wrong on all counts. By the late 1970s and 80s, the CIA and MI6 were publicly reviled in Indian media. And yet, the infrastructure they helped build, the secrecy, the covert action mindset, stayed behind. Fast forward to today. Under Narendra Modi, India's government has re-embraced covert operations. NSA Ajit Doval, a former intelligence chief himself, is credited with orchestrating cross-border surgical strikes in Pakistan, influence ops in Sri Lanka and Myanmar, and a more aggressive intelligence doctrine that some say goes too far. As McGarr puts it, India may soon need to choose between its 22 official languages and a new language of killing. Why does this all matter? Because the world is entering a new age of great power rivalry, and South Asia is again at the center. Understanding India's intelligence history helps us decode modern foreign policy decisions, see through narratives of nationalism versus foreign meddling, and realize how covert power often outlasts open diplomacy. Paul McGarr's Spying in South Asia gives us not just a history book, but a mirror, reflecting how democratic ideals, strategic necessity, and covert manipulation often coexist. If you found this interesting, hit like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments. Should we do a deep dive into India's RAW next, or the secret CIA operations in Tibet? And if you want to grab the book, it's Spying in South Asia by Paul McGarr. Highly recommended. Until next time, stay curious and stay in the loop.